Hi, I'm Kamaldeen, professor in the Department of Linguistics. In this video, we're going to talk about bilingualism. We're going to talk about what it is, what exactly is bilingualism. We're going to define it a little bit. We're going to talk who it's for, so who can be a bilingual. We'll have a little discussion about some of the advantages and disadvantages, and that should answer the question of why you should even care about bilingualism. And then we will talk about what kinds of things you and society can do if you want to increase bilingualism, either at the societal level or at the individual level. So first, let's start with a question of what it is. What exactly is bilingualism? Well, bilingualism, we have an idea. When you talk to just anybody on the street, what is you ask them what bilingualism is, they'll tell you it's got to do with two languages. Somebody has to know something about two languages, which is kind of true. But is it enough to say that someone who knows something about a second language is enough to be a bilingual? So for example, if I know the word mahalo in Hawaiian, does that make me a bilingual? If that's the only word that I know other than English? I think everyone would agree, no, that's not the right definition of bilingualism. So that's not enough, right? It's got to be more than that. What about if you've studied a second language and you spent, 2 years studying a second language? Does that make you a bilingual? I think there too, the answer to that question is no. That's not enough. There's a sense in which you need to have a certain level of proficiency. I know a lot of people that have studied a language for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and they still really can't speak it, right? They certainly can't read it or write it. I've studied many languages in my life, and there's several that I studied for many years, and I wouldn't call myself proficient in them. So that's not enough to become a bilingual. You need to do more than that as well. So an informal definition that we might all kind of agree on is that a bilingual is someone who speaks two languages well enough. What that means exactly, I'm not sure, but there is this vague idea that you have to be able to speak two languages well enough. Linguists have a slightly more detailed and specific definition. The linguistics definition for a bilingual, the one that we're going to be using, is that to be a bilingual, you need to speak two languages to native-like or near native-like abilities. So you need to be almost a native speaker of two languages in order to be a bilingual. That's a very difficult thing to be, by the way. It's kind of a technical definition. I think in everyday speech, that's not the definition most people use for bilingual, but that's the definition we're going to go with. So there are two kinds of bilinguals, at least in linguistics. These have to do with when you begin acquiring your second language or the two languages. So the first is called a simultaneous bilingual, and the second is called a sequential bilingual. So a simultaneous bilingual is someone who acquires two languages, usually from birth, at the same time, as the word simultaneous suggests. A sequential bilingual, on the other hand, is somebody that begins acquiring one language from birth, and then a few years later, usually still within childhood, they begin acquiring a second language. Okay, so just to schematize it for you, here's a timeline, and on the left we have birth, and on the right we have roughly 12 years. And if you're a child and if you get your first language at birth, like most kids do, and then you also get your second language at birth, and they're both there in your environment at the same time, you are likely to become a simultaneous bilingual. So here imagine a child of a mixed culture family. So let's say mom is American, speaks English, and dad, say, Japanese and speaks Japanese. And at home, mom speaks English to the child, dad speaks Japanese to the child. That child has a good chance of becoming a simultaneous bilingual. A sequential bilingual, on the other hand, is if you get the first language at birth, but then a few years later, here I've shown around 6 or 7 years of age, you begin getting your second language. That leads to what we call a sequential bilingual. And these two different kinds of bilinguals, simultaneous and sequential, they actually have different profiles. When linguists test them, they behave slightly differently, which is why we have this distinction in linguistics. But here for a sequential bilingual, imagine a child that is born, say, in America, and at around age 6, mom or dad or both or whoever, some parent gets a job in another country and moves, and the child begins elementary school, say, in another country, speaking another language or requiring that they speak another language. This is what sets up sequential bilingualism. I think the late Kobe Bryant was a sequential bilingual, right? He spoke Italian. I don't know exactly what age he was when he and his father went to Italy, because his father was like a basketball player in Italy. But he has a very high level of proficiency in Italian, and it's because sometime in childhood he began to be exposed to Italian and he had to acquire Italian. He's not a simultaneous bilingual, he's a sequential bilingual. So who can become a bilingual? Who can be a bilingual? Can you become a bilingual? Can anyone become a bilingual? If you're monolingual right now, can you eventually become a bilingual? Well, anyone can be a bilingual, but it's not so easy for adults. So if you're monolingual right now, you could become a bilingual if you tried hard enough. If you study a language and you go to that country and you get a job there and you immerse yourself in the language and you get a tutor and you maybe marry someone who's a monolingual speaker of that language and you work really, really hard, it's possible for you to become a bilingual, but it takes a lot of effort and it's not always successful. Children, on the other hand, are far more successful. They're far more likely to become highly proficient or native-like or near-native-like speakers of a second language. And so in childhood, bilingualism is by far the better option if you're interested in developing bilingual individuals, as opposed to adulthood bilingualism. And that's because children acquire language just across the boards much, much better than adults do. And we all kind of have this sense that that's true. Early childhood is where all the action happens, at least with respect to language. If you want children to acquire language well, if you as a society want to have a bilingual society, a population that is fluent in 2 languages, you've got to start in childhood. You think about how the Hawaiian movement has focused most of its efforts on Hawaiian immersion schools. And that's exactly for this reason. It's because they quite rightly recognized that if in the future you want a bilingual population, the children are going to give you that. Adults, they won't really be able to acquire the language, at least predictably and reliably the way children can. So what does this mean about high school classes and university classes? Are they a waste of time? Well, let me be clear. I think those are very, very important. I very strongly support a foreign language requirement at high school and a foreign language requirement at university. And that's because you learn different ways of communicating, different ways of expressing yourself, different ways of thinking. You learn a lot about culture in those languages. You gain some level of proficiency. You're not going to become a bilingual, but there's a lot of worth in these requirements, in these high school and university level requirements. But they're not going to get you bilingualism, right? The way to get bilingualism is to start in childhood, like I said. So early childhood bilingual immersion is the way that you get a bilingual population. And I referenced the Hawaiian community earlier, but many such communities in the United States have recognized that. In California, there are Japanese bilingual immersion schools. There are Chinese bilingual immersion schools. There's a lot of Korean immersion that happens in California. So this is really the only reliable way that you're going to get a long-term stable bilingual population. The way you do it as an individual, so that's at the societal level. But let's say you are a family. You're in a relationship with someone and you decide to have a child, and you want to raise that child bilingual, how do you do that? Well, you have to immerse the child in 2 languages, preferably from birth. Simultaneous bilingualism is the way to go. So, for example, one parent speaks one language, another parent speaks the other language. That is the most common model for bilingual immersion for young children. I'll say this though, it's not easy, especially in the United States. It's not easy raising a child bilingual, and that's because the parent that has to speak the non-English language is under tremendous pressure. It's really, really difficult on that parent. There's an awful lot of pressure for English to creep in. And the child is going to want to speak English. The child is going to reject that parent who doesn't speak English, may reject that parent who doesn't speak English. So the parents need to recognize that and make adjustments accordingly. So it's not easy. Doing it at the societal level with immersion schools, that also is not easy. It's potentially very expensive. And so the question that you should be asking right now is, why do I care about bilingualism? What's the advantage to bilingualism? Why don't we just carry on the way that we are? Speaking English is perfectly good. We are likely to get jobs. It's a global language. Why do we need the second language? Why should you care about bilingualism? Well, there are in fact lots of advantages to bilingualism. Obvious ones are employment. So you become more marketable on the job market if you speak more than one language, especially if you speak it proficiently. And I'm not talking about just translators or teachers. In business, being proficient in a second language is a really key skill to have. And if you are native-like or near native-like, that's even more valuable, right? So that's a proven fact that a second language to a high level of proficiency gives you a leg up in the job market. It's also been shown in lots and lots of formal academic studies that there is academic success associated with bilinguals. So bilinguals tend to do better in school, and that of course means better grades, better degrees, better jobs, right? So there's economic advantage there as well. Other studies have looked at the social connections that children have, and it turns out that bilingual children have stronger and wider social networks than monolingual children. And that might have to do with the fact that they have 2 separate social circles that they can interact with. That gives them lots more opportunity to practice their social skills and make them better at social connection. And that, of course, is a huge advantage. There's an economic advantage to society, not the individual. Previously, we talked about economic advantages to you as an individual, but to society to be bilingual. It opens up all sorts of connections with other countries. And so trade and culture and all of that becomes accessible to your population. And so that's a big advantage. And there are actually documented cognitive advantages to being a bilingual. So bilinguals develop abilities that monolinguals don't, or rather they develop them better than monolinguals do. So for example, there have been studies that have shown that children do better on logic tasks than monolinguals do. Children do better on what's called metalinguistic tasks than monolinguals do. Metalinguistics is the ability to talk about language like an object, like you can talk about the grammar of a language. You can think about language as an object of study. That gives you advantages in terms of reading and writing and thinking about poetry and that sort of thing. And that, of course, is a good way to do well in school. Bilinguals have better memories, perhaps because they have to have larger memories to store all those words, right? Those different words and those rules. Here's an example of a specific example of an advantage that bilingual children have. How do you give a good definition in English? So if somebody says, define this word for me, what's a good way to define a word? Kaplan in 1977 went and interviewed a bunch of teachers, high school teachers, and asked them to judge various kinds of definitions. And they gave high scores to certain kinds of definitions. Those definitions, for example, if you were going to define what is a Cybertruck, Here's an example of a good definition of a Cybertruck. A Cybertruck is a kind of electric vehicle that was recently announced by Tesla, which looks a little like a warthog from Halo 1, if that means anything to you. The point is that this definition has a particular structure, and the structure is this. An X is a kind of Y with defining features Z. That's the way that teachers expect smart students to define words, right? They expect that kind of definition. And when they get that kind of definition from a student, they mark it with a big red check, right? And you get extra credit for good definitions, etc., right? If you do a different kind of definition, like, for example, a Cybertruck is not a regular truck. It's kind of a definition. It's not a great definition, but it's a kind of definition. You don't get scored as well by teachers, and so your academic success gets knocked down just a little bit. What Kaplan found was that bilingual children are better at giving these kinds of definitions than monolinguals, and that advantage began at around 3rd grade. So prior to that, they were perhaps inferior to monolinguals. They weren't doing as well as monolinguals, but starting at 3rd grade and beyond, bilinguals just did better at this kind of thing. This is a specific task, but there is a whole list of such things where bilinguals do better than monolinguals do. So we've gone through a whole series of advantages for bilingualism. There are a couple of disadvantages. There are others, but these are sort of the major disadvantages that people usually talk about, and I just want to quickly go over them and see what we think about them. The first is that it's true that bilinguals are what we might call late bloomers in language. So let's say we're in America and you're raising a bilingual child. That child, when the child gets to 1st grade or 2nd grade, they're a little bit behind in terms of English than their monolingual peers, which kind of makes sense. I mean, they're acquiring 2 languages while the monolingual child is acquiring just 1, right? So the monolingual child is a little bit in advance of the bilingual child. And when you get into 1st grade or kindergarten or 2nd grade, teachers will not quite recognize that bilingualism is at the source of that slight delay. And so the children, the teachers might judge those children, the bilingual children, as less smart, as perhaps linguistically delayed, perhaps cognitively delayed. Whereas in reality, they're just bilingual. There's nothing actually delayed about them. But they are slightly behind their monolingual peers in 1st grade and 2nd grade. And that raises fears. I'll talk about that in a moment. Let me just mention the second disadvantage. The second disadvantage is what's called code switching. That is when you switch between languages, and that's seen as a particular weakness. So let's go back to the first disadvantage, which is that bilingual kids are late bloomers. It's true that they are late bloomers. That's actually statistically true. It's been proven in study after study after study. In kindergarten, in 1st grade, in 2nd grade, bilinguals are reliably behind their monolingual peers. And the issue is that teachers often misjudge that. They think maybe the child needs therapy, maybe the child needs to go to ESL, and that has a negative academic impact. And so parents fear that their child will struggle in school, their child will be stigmatized by this, the child will be sidelined into a special ed course, for example, when the child doesn't really need that, and that stigma might follow the child all the way through their schooling. And you can imagine a parent who only wants the best for their child fears this and says, you know what, I'm not going to do that to my child. That's an understandable fear that parents have. Code switching is seen as a weakness because what you're doing in code switching is you're switching between 2 languages, and teachers tend to think of that as an indication that they don't have control over the major language, right? So here's an example from a Swahili English bilingual child. The child said something like, "Sijui he will come or not." And sijui in Swahili means I don't know. So what the child was trying to say is, I don't know if he's going to come or not. And what the child did was they switched between these 2 languages. This is a very, very common thing amongst bilinguals. And teachers perceive this as a lack of control, or in this case, of English. They don't really quite know how to do it in English, and so they go back and rely on Swahili. And so you can see how that would be perceived as a weakness in English, and therefore maybe the child needs ESL, maybe the child needs therapy, maybe the child needs to be side streamed, maybe the child is not as good academically as other kids. But bilingual children, so the thing is that both those cases are false. Both those disadvantages are false. It's true that bilingual children do struggle early on in schooling, but they quickly catch up to their monolingual peers. And in fact, they then exceed monolingual peers. So by around third grade, bilinguals are on par with monolinguals. And from that point onwards, it's been shown that bilinguals actually do better than monolinguals in a whole host of cognitive tasks, like I described earlier. And so the academic advantage actually lies with bilingual children, not monolingual children. That's the irony of it. It's true that they struggle in the first couple of years, but then they have this big leg up over monolinguals. And so if you as a parent want to give your child the gift of academic success, one thing you could do is make them a bilingual. Right? So that's why it's worth the effort. The difficulty that I described earlier for bilingual parents to raise a bilingual child, that's why it's worth that effort, because there is this academic payoff further down the line. Moreover, code switching, while it may be seen as a sign of weakness, is actually a sign of great skill. It requires cognitive flexibility to switch between these two systems on the fly within a particular sentence, right? And so that flexibility is what a lot of researchers think leads to the cognitive advantages that they then enjoy later on in schooling. It's that being able to play with these two different systems in your mind gives you this extra cognitive strength, which then plays out in your academics, certainly after third grade. But it's like giving the child a little heavy weight to work with. It makes them stronger. Giving them a second language is initially difficult, but it makes them stronger. So code switching really is not a concern for bilingual children, because they will eventually use that code switching and outperform their monolingual peers in so many ways. So just wrapping up, I want to talk about a few myths about bilingualism and dispel them, right? So the first is that bilingual children get confused more. And that's categorically false. It comes from this idea of code switching. If a child is switching between two languages, someone might say, oh, this child is confused about what the rules of English are. No, they're just using their language flexibly to express things that they may not be able to do just using English. It's too much for a child's brain to handle two languages at once, plus to do math and reading and science and art and music and all these other things. That too is completely false. Children around the world are doing it very, very successfully. Think about it, a society like Singapore, where children are often trilingual, and Singaporean children are amongst the best at math and reading in the world, right? So it's just clearly false that children are unable to handle more than one language at a time. They have plenty of capacity in their minds, in their brains. Third myth is that, America is an English-speaking country. We have to maintain English as our national language. Bilingualism hurts that national unity. First of all, America is not a monolingual country. It's not an English-speaking country. English is, of course, the lingua franca of the country, but there is no official language in the United States. You do need to show some proficiency of English to become a citizen, but if you're born in this country, there's no requirement that you speak English. You can speak any language you like, right? Moreover, there are plenty of countries in the world that are bilingual, that have a really strong sense of national unity. So bilingualism doesn't hurt unity. And think about American unity right now. Are we a united country? Not really. And that's got nothing to do with the languages that we speak. It's got to do with other sort of political and philosophical and social issues, which has splintered us nationally. So language does not necessarily unite you or splinter you. That is, in fact, a myth. That is false. Fourth, bilingual education is too expensive. We can't afford to have like 2 sets of teachers teaching 2 sets of curricula. That is not necessarily true, because yeah, there is an investment up front, but the economic benefits more than pay off for that initial investment. So I'm going to label this as false, but there is a little bit of a question about it. Maybe we could have a debate about that. So we could say it's questionable. So let me slap a questionable tag on it. Doesn't look as good as the false tag, but that's at least something we can debate, right? And lastly, there are a lot of people who say, well, let's focus on the fundamentals. Let's not focus on language. Let's focus on math, reading, science. Those are the important things. Those are the things that are going to give us an advantage in the world economy, in the world market. We can always catch up with language, art, music later on in life. Let's give these kids a solid foundation in math and reading, and then we'll give them language in high school. We'll give them art and music in high school. I disagree with all of that. I think art, music, and language are the things that need to be given to children at a young age, alongside math and reading. And that's because, as we said earlier, you're not going to become a bilingual if you're exposed to a second language in your teen years or as an adult. You need to get the language at a young age. You need to get the language when you're preferably younger than 6, but certainly younger than 10. And if that exposure is delayed until, say, age 15 or 16 when you're in high school, then you're never going to get to a level of proficiency where we could call you a bilingual. Whereas the bilingual child has the capacity to do extremely well in math and reading and science, as well as in language and in art and in music and other kinds of cultural and art type things. So there's no reason to limit children to just math and reading, because all of these other things make them well-rounded people. They give them skills that will benefit them in the future, and it doesn't hurt them in any way. Evidence for that comes from many, many economies around the world. I mentioned Singapore, but think about Scandinavia, where most children are bilingual between their language and English, or another Scandinavian language. Many countries in Europe, children are bilingual or trilingual. Think about children in Switzerland. They are often trilingual or even quadrilingual. And you don't think of Switzerland as an economic slouch, or Scandinavia as an economic slouch, or Singapore as an economic slouch. Those kids end up being really smart and very, very competitive in the world market. So there's no reason for us to focus on the fundamentals. The fundamentals are everything, and we need to give children all of these crucial fundamental tools, including a second or third or fourth language. So I'm going to list that one also as a false myth. So wrapping up then, what I want you to take away from this video is that bilingualism is very broadly a positive. There are some challenges with it, yes, but it is overall a big positive, and it's something that we should all be aspiring towards, either for ourselves or for the next generation. It benefits individuals in numerous ways, and it benefits society in numerous ways, economic, cultural, and others. And moreover, it's the norm amongst human beings. If you look at the world's population, the vast majority of human beings are bilingual, trilingual, or multilingual. And that's because it's not in any way unusual. If you think about our ancestors, way back when we were hunter-gatherers, you had little tribes or clans of probably around 50 people. And you interacted with other tribes or clans on occasion. But each of these clans spoke different languages. And you needed to know the language of each of your neighboring clans. And so it's very likely, we don't have any direct evidence for this, but it's very likely that those pre-civilized human beings who spoke language actually were multilingual. And so multilingualism is in our history, it's in our genes, it's who we are. The idea of monolingualism, that's the unnatural notion. So bilingualism is the norm. And I would encourage you to think about bilingualism in this positive light, that there are benefits to it, very few negatives to it. And if you're able to give bilingualism to a child, I highly encourage you to try. It's not without its challenges, but it's certainly worth your while and that child's while. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please get in touch with your instructor and we'll try to answer those questions.